Hey everyone, this is my review of the new Nikon 14-30 f4 for the Z mount. Okay, so a lot of the initial specifications I went over in my very first look at this lens. If you've not seen that video already, I'll pop a link up here somewhere. So I've had the wonderful opportunity of being able to shoot with this lens for the past couple of weeks. Those of you that follow me on Instagram would have seen that I've been using it to shoot coastal landscapes, some cityscape type things as well. So what I want to look at first is image quality, and to do that we're just going to head over to my Mac and we're going to look at some of the shots in Lightroom. As always, I'm going to talk through some images and you guys can then make your own mind up as to how you think this lens performs. Okay, so what we have here first of all is the 14-30 on this left hand side over here at 14mm f4 on a tripod on a Z7. So both of these shots are taken on the same camera. The only thing that's changed is the lens. So 14-30 f4 on the left hand side at f4. Then we have the 14-24 2.8 on the right hand side, again at 14mm and stopped down to f4. So technically the 14-24 has got the advantage right now because it's stopped down from the f2.8 that it could be at. So let's go take a look at these pictures at 1:1 first of all. So we'll zoom into them at 1:1. And as you would expect, both pictures are equally just as sharp. If anything, the 14-30 starting to be a bit sharper, but between them at the moment there's not much. So let's take a look at 2:1, and we can see quite clearly that the 14-30 is sharper than the 14-24 when they're both at f4. So remember, the 14-30 is wide open and the 14-24 is stopped down to f4 at the moment, and the 14-30 is outperforming the Nikon 14-24 2.8. What we have here is the 14-30 f4 on the left hand side set to 14mm at f11. And then on the right hand side we have the 14-24 set at 14mm, also at f11. So I just wanted to show you what the sharpness difference was like even when the lenses are both stopped down to f11. So let's take a look. We'll jump right in here at 2:1. So it's 2:1 on the 14-24 over here, and then 2:1 on the 14-30. The 14-30 was sharper slightly at f4, and at f11 the difference just increases, and you can see quite clearly that the 14-24 is just that bit softer even when it's stopped down to f11. Okay, so what we have here is a test of corner sharpness. So we have the 14-24 stopped down to f4 on the left hand side. We're going to focus on here in the D850 logo in the corner. And then on the right hand side we have the 14-30 at 14mm at f4. Same camera, same placement, same subject. Straight away at 2:1 you can clearly see that again the 14-30 now on the right hand side is outperforming the 14-24 2.8. And remember, the 14-24 is stopped down to f4, it's not wide open. So even in the corners, the 14-30 is sharper than the 14-24 2.8. Right, so what we have here is the 14-30 f4 on the left hand side, and the 14-30 is set to f4, and it's also set to 16mm. And then we have the 16 to 35 f4 on the right hand side, which is set to f4 and also 16 millimeters. So everything's the same, everything's identical between these two. Let's go take a look at some of the sharpness differences. So this is the 14 to 30 at 2 to 1, and this is the 16 to 35 at 2 to 1, and yeah, the 14 to 30 is sharper, which I kind of expected. The 14 to 30 was sharper than the 24 to 70 as well, so it's kind of what I anticipated really. But here we have the 14 to 30 on the left hand side set to 16 millimeters at f11, and we have the 16 to 35 at 16 millimeters also at f11. The difference is not as much. I would still say that the 14 to 30 is the sharper lens. The 16 to 35 has definitely gained a lot of sharpness by being stopped down to f11, but still the 14 to 30 looks sharper. So the real kind of picture quality difference is when you start to look at the corners. So when we compare the corner of the 14 to 30, which is on the left hand side, versus the corners of the 16 to 35, there's quite a bit of a difference, and this is mainly to do with ghosting and flaring. So both of these lenses are at 16 millimeters, so 16 millimeters f4, and then we're also at 16 millimeters f4 on the 16 to 35. So if I zoom in, and you can see straight away that the 16 to 35 at f4, 60 millimeters in the corner of the frame has a lot of ghosting in the shot. Just starts to fringe. It could be to do with the LED panel that I'm using, but they're under the same light source, they're taken in the same exact situation, same settings. It's all down to the quality of the coatings and also the quality of lens. So even in edge sharpness, the 14 to 30 stands out considerably against the 16 to 35 here. Just before we get into this, all of these images have been unedited in Lightroom. I'm just showing you as they come out of the camera into Lightroom. So these are just raw files. So what I'd like to do first is just take you through some real-world example shots that I've got while shooting with this lens over the past couple of months. So this is taken on the 14 to 30 at 14 millimeters f8 on a Nikon Z7. And it's on a tripod. We're using a shutter speed of 20 seconds, so any kind of movement or ghosting is because of the long exposure. So if we just have a look around the frame at 1:1, the detail that we get is lovely and sharp. At f8 we don't have a massive depth of field, but it's large enough. But the main interest that I've got here is these supports for the bridge that runs above us in this frame here. So that's kind of what I mainly want to be looking at. Right in the corners, there's a tiny bit of distortion, but nothing really major. It seems to be really nice and well controlled. Still nice and sharp in the corners as well. So let's just have a quick look at 2:1, and we can still see that we retain quite a lot of detail, especially on a really wide angle lens. There's a lot of detail in the paint and sharpness here, and then we can see that we actually probably maybe just start to drift out of the depth of field. But sharpness wise and detail wise, just a really good detailed shot at 14 f8. So here we have another shot taken on the 14 to 30, 14 millimeters f11, 10 seconds this time. All of this movement around here is because of the traffic driving in front of me, so we do have a lot of traffic trails in here. But just wanted to show you kind of some of the details on the building in the distance, just to show you real life sharpness. It gives you some pretty nice results, and there's not too much distortion on the buildings that are right in the corners either. Nothing that we couldn't go in and fix if we needed to. So here we have 14 millimeters f8, 30-second long exposure. It's on a tripod, but the bridge that we're stood on here is prone to a bit of movement, so we'll see. And straight away, just cropping in at 2:1, we just get some nice detail, nice movement in the people walking past us because of the 30-second long exposure. But even in the distance, the sharpness and detail that we get on the buildings is quite nice. The London Eye, we can see individual details as nice and sharp. One thing that you will notice is that it controls bright highlights quite well. You get some quite nice starbursts, even at f8. So here we have an example from the day where we're shooting coastal landscapes. This is 14mm on a Z7 f11, 10-second exposure, really low ISO. This has also been taken using NISI filters. So this has a graduated filter and also a full ND filter in front of it as well. And you can see there's not a lot of vignetting at all caused by the holder or the filters or anything like that. So pretty impressive overall. But do keep in mind that there are two filters in front of it when it comes to sharpness. So we're going straight away at 1:1 and really nice and sharp. Lovely details here in the foreground and the pebbles. We do start to get a bit of haze in the distance that starts to take out some of our sharpness, but again, well controlled highlights. That's one of the things that really surprised me about this lens, is it works really well when shooting directly towards the sun if you need to be doing that in your landscape shots. Edge sharpness is really nice. So take a look at 2:1, let's just see. So here again, shooting straight towards the sun, 14mm f11, 8-second exposure. If we look first of all at 1:1, nice and sharp, good detail in the shadows, nice detail here in the sand as it just captures the sun. So here at 14mm again, f11, 10-second exposure. Again, we have two NISI filters in front of this, so a graduated filter and then a full ND filter on the 100mm system holder. If we just go in straight away at 2:1, we can see that we've got some really nice detail in the sand and these little bubbles as the water's pulling back through the sand. Some lovely detail in these rocks as well, great sharpness. Really well controlled from the bright highlight of the sun as well. But still well controlled sharpness, well controlled detail, not a massive amount of distortion, nothing really in this, there we go. So overall I've been really impressed with the results that I get from the 14 to 30. It just makes my life a bit easier as well because it can use the 100mm filter system. So this shot is just an example of a long exposure just to show you how the lens works under those circumstances. So this is a 14 to 30, 14mm f8, 131 seconds. This is shot with two NISI filters in front of it again. So we have a 10-stop filter and then we have a 1.2 graduated filter as well. I'm just going to go straight in here at 2:1 just to show you detail and sharpness in the grass, which I think looks really nice. Then even in the corners, we're obviously not as sharp as the center, but we still retain a lot of detail in the corners of the frame. I thought I'd just take you through some of the shots that I've taken with this lens and some that kind of really stand out to me. So here we have 14 to 30, 14mm, f8, 30 seconds. Really nice waterfall in front of us, flowing river. Also two filters on this to obviously allow us to shoot 30 seconds in daylight. This is one of my favorite sunrise shots. So here we have the 14mm f8, 128 seconds. This is also again with a grad and then an ND filter, ISO 64. Really nice and wide. The 14mm just really allows me to get everything in, especially this nice big waterfall in the foreground. This is one of the shots that I've only really shot at 30mm. Mostly I've been shooting it ultra wide at 14. But here I'm at 30mm, f8, 30 seconds, and then ISO 64. Also again with the graduated filter, a 0.9 graduated filter and a 10-stop filter here. Just another shot here that I particularly like, 14mm, f8, ISO 64, and I'm at 400 seconds here. So to get that long, I'll use a 15 stop filter, and this is also with a 1.2 graduated filter as well. I really like shooting really long exposures. I've got a few more examples of long exposures. There's a lot of those on my Instagram account if you want to go and check those out, but 400 seconds isn't really that long for me. But I thought it might be useful just to show you guys some of the shots that you can expect to get from a 14 to 30 when using it with filters and shooting long exposures. Hope you found that useful.
So next thing I want to talk about is, who is this lens for? So you might be watching this video because you already have a Z6 and a Z7 and you want a really good wide angle lens. So this is definitely it. If you're after a wide angle lens that works really well on this camera, this is the one that you would buy. Nothing else competes with this in terms of wide angle performance from a zoom lens. If you're watching this video because you already own the 14 to 24 and or the 16 to 35, and you might be thinking to yourself, should I continue to use the 14 to 24 or the 16 to 35 on my existing Z6 or Z7, or do I switch to the 14 to 30? That is obviously entirely your decision, and the main port of call would be, well, is paying for another new lens that's very similar to a lens that I already own worthwhile? And only you would ever be able to make that decision. Personally, I have the 14 to 24, and I feel like because this is so much smaller and lighter than both the 14 to 24 and 16 to 35, that I would much prefer to carry this than the 14 to 24. And on that note, because the 14 to 30 can use the 100mm filters, I would rather carry a 100mm filter set than carry the 150mm filter set that you have to get to put on the front of the 14 to 24. The only real reason that you might not want to go and buy one of these lenses is if you wanted to wait for the 14 to 24 2.8 variation that they'll launch eventually for the Z6 and Z7. So if you are happy with your existing 14 to 24 2.8, then I would continue to shoot with that lens. However, if you want something that's sharper, smaller, lighter, easy to carry and easier to use with filters, but still allows you to get to 14mm, this is the lens that you want to go and buy. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is how good this lens works with different types of filters. So out in the field, when I'm using filters and shooting my landscape photography, I always opt for drop-in filters in a filter holder. Now in the past, I've used those on the 14 to 24, and that's meant that I need to get a particular holder that fits that lens. That would be required to go and buy one from either Lee Filters, and they make a kit called their SW150 set, and they are filters that are 150mm in size, and they fit into a specific holder specifically designed for the 14 to 24. I would also then use filters from a company called NIKON Filters, who do also 150mm filters that fit into a specifically designed holder for the 14-24. In both instances, those holders are large and the filters are much bigger than normal, and you need to carry a lot of kit for them to then be able to work. Not everybody wants to use large, heavy filter holders and filters. So what some people opt for is the smaller 100mm filter holder systems available from Lee and NIKON again, and there's a few other brands out there as well who do these systems. Now, the problem with that is that you were never able to use the 100mm system on the 14 to 24. You had to then go back to the 16 to 35. This is the first lens that allows you to go to 14mm, and you can still put a 100mm filter system on the front of it. The ring on this is 82mm, by the way.
So when it comes to the 100mm filter holders, there's a bit of variance depending on the brand. So first of all, let's start with Lee. And Lee's 100mm holder has this ring attached to the front of the two slots. And this ring is what causes the holder to vignette. If you remove this ring and set the holder to just 2 slots, then you can use it on the 14 to 30 with no vignetting and no visible sign of the holder in the shot. However, if you leave this polarizing ring on the front, then it will vignette and you can see the holder in the corners of your shot at 14mm. Lee have obviously launched a new holder, and I have yet to have hands-on with this holder, so I've not been able to test to see if it still vignettes or not. However, the polarizer still attaches to the front of the holder, so I would imagine it would be very similar to their existing 100mm holder. When it comes to Nissi is the only holder that I've tried that does not vignette. The main reason for this is that the polarizer attachment sits at the back of the holder, right in front of the lens. And what I actually use personally is the Nissi V5 holder with 3 slots in it. And even with 3 slots, it still doesn't vignette. That's the holder that I've been most happy with using currently.
If you are using 82mm screw-in filters, it really depends on the screw-in filter itself. So I've tried a few different ones. If you are stacking 2 together, it's definitely going to vignette. If you just have one single 82mm screw-in filter, you're generally going to be okay. I will always opt for a drop-in filter system. I really don't get on with screw-in filters and screw-in NDs. I've tried a lot from a lot of different companies, and generally I've always had my best results if I can use square filters that drop into a holder, and they would be then grads and then full ND filters. Okay, so I hope you found this video useful. I hope it's given you some insight as to how this lens performs out in the field and how you can expect it to work with filters. Personally, I love it. It's going to be a lens that I'm going to use a hell of a lot. This is why I've called this an initial review, because this lens is pretty much going to be one of my most used lenses over the coming month. We have a lot of workshops planned where this lens is going to be used. I'll have a lot of examples that will pop up on my Instagram account, and then also probably further down the line in a couple of months, I'll do a long-term review on this lens to see how I feel about its performance. But generally, I've already decided that I'm not going to use my 14 to 24 going forward. This will replace it. So I hope you found this video useful. Please do like and subscribe if you've enjoyed today's video. And I will see you very soon. Thank you very much for watching.